Welcome to Animation Foundations. This course is designed to give you a basic grounding in the core principles of animation and some of the basic skills that go into crafting a scene. By understanding and applying these fundamentals, you'll be well on your way to making your characters truly come alive. This course covers universal principles that apply to any kind of animation, whether 2D, 3D, traditional, or digital. This makes it a great course for any aspiring animator and a perfect companion for any of Bloop Animation's software courses. In this intro section, we'll cover some basic information about animation and some of the vocabulary we'll be using. Then we'll be ready to dig into the main portion of the course, the 12 principles of animation. From there, we'll look at some more specific animation skills and see how those principles can be applied. I hope you're eager and excited to take your first steps into the world of animation. So let's get started. There are many different types of animation, some of which you're probably already familiar with. So to start out this course, let's do a quick rundown of the different types of animation and what the differences and similarities are. Let's start with 3D animation, which is also called CGI, which stands for computer-generated imagery. This is the most popular type of animation for feature films currently, and it's become common in TV and short films as well. This is also the same type of animation used to create digital characters for live-action films, and animation for 3D video games. In 3D animation, an animator uses a digital puppet called a character rig to position a character and then use a system of motion paths, or splines, to define the movement of the character between those poses. From there, the computer creates all of the frames of the animation. 3D animation involves a technically intensive process which often involves many separate specialists to model the character, rig it with bones and controls, animate it, and then texture and light it for the final output. In this course, we're just focusing on that animation phase. Next, let's look at 2D animation. The first type of 2D animation might be called traditional animation or cell animation, but I prefer the term hand-drawn animation, because that's the most clear and relevant thing that distinguishes it. This is the classic kind of 2D animation that you're probably most familiar with. In the old days, animators drew characters frame by frame, and then those drawings were transferred onto clear acetate sheets called cells for painting. That's where the term cell animation comes from. However, through the 1990s, almost all animation studios stopped using cells and started scanning drawings into the computer for digital coloring. And now, many hand-drawn animators skip the paper too and draw directly on the computer with a tablet or Wacom Cintiq monitor. So hand-drawn animation could be done entirely analog or entirely digitally, or some mix of the two. And it still might even largely look the same. But the important thing is that hand-drawn animators still create their animation frame by frame using the same techniques and principles as in those old days of paper and cells. There are also new ways to create 2D animation using a 2D digital puppet. These are 2D characters built with a system of bones and controls that can be manipulated in a way similar to a 3D character rig. The difference between 2D rigged characters and hand-drawn characters can get a bit blurry though. Software like Toon Boom Harmony and Adobe Animate let you seamlessly mix and match hand-drawn animation with 2D puppet techniques, sometimes even within the same character. This character has bones that let the animator pose it, but it also has other parts that are animated by hand. The next big category is stop-motion animation. There are several variants of stop-motion, but they all involve manipulating real-world objects. In higher-end stop-motion, a specially rigged puppet is shot on a miniature stage. The rig is moved slightly and photographed one frame at a time. When the photos are shown in sequence, it creates the illusion of movement. You may have seen a similar technique called claymation, where malleable characters are used, though they're generally made out of a substance called plasticine, not actual clay. You can also do stop motion with regular figurines and objects, like all those great Lego animations. Another variation of stop motion is paper cutout animation. In this style, characters are built out of paper shapes. They might be pinned together at joints to make a posable figure, or pieces might be set in place so that they can be swapped out. They're then moved and photographed frame by frame, just like a stop-motion puppet. Another rarer type of stop-motion is called pixelation. In pixelation, real people are used instead of puppets. All of these types of stop-motion share an important characteristic. They all have to be shot straight ahead, which means starting at frame 1 and shooting each frame one after another all the way through the end of the scene. If a mistake is made on one frame, it's very difficult to fix it without having to start all over again. You can't just redraw one drawing. That makes stop motion a particularly intense and difficult type of animation. The last big category of animation is motion graphics. Motion graphics focuses on making dynamic and interesting presentations of moving text, logos, and basic illustrations. It's common to see both 2D and 3D motion graphics. You'll find them everywhere in commercials, explainer videos, and TV productions. Proper character animation is generally outside the scope of motion graphics, but many of the principles we'll be going over in the course apply to motion graphics too. Hopefully this overview has given you an idea of what kinds of animation you'd like to explore. In the next video, we'll go over some of the vocabulary we'll be using over the course of these lessons. I'll see you there! There are a lot of specialized terms in animation and animated filmmaking, and I just won't be able to go over all of them in one video. For a broader glossary of animation terms, check out the Bloop Animation book and course, Animation for Beginners. What I will be going over in this video are the important terms that will come up over the rest of this course. I'll be explaining some of these terms in depth later, but I want you to have a basic familiarity now so that you're better able to follow along. Let's get started. The timeline is the part of your animation software that represents your animation's progress over time. Depending on your software, you might use the timeline to make changes to the timing of your animation as well as the position of the elements. The frame rate of an animation is the number of individual images or frames that are being displayed over the course of 1 second. This is a setting you can adjust in your software. Animation is usually done in 24 frames per second. Working on ones or twos is a term used in hand-drawn animation. Working on ones would mean doing a new drawing over every single frame of the animation. Working on twos means displaying each drawing for 2 frames. So 1 second of animation at 24 frames per second would only be 12 drawings, not 24. This looks fine in most instances, and there are even cases where drawings can be held longer. Normally, in live-action filmmaking, the term shot refers to the images between camera edits. And a scene is all the shots and dialogue that take place at a particular location for a continuous block of time. However, often in animation, particularly 2D animation, we use the term scene to mean what live-action filmmakers would call a shot. If you hear me use the word scene, I probably mean it in the sense of a shot, a specific continuous piece of animation in between camera cuts. Keyframes, breakdowns, and in-betweens are important terms, but they mean slightly different things depending on the type of animation you're doing. In hand-drawn animation, keyframes, or just keys, are the major important poses that define the scene. Breakdowns come between keys and define what the motion from key to key will be. In-betweens are all the frames that come in between to smooth out the emotion. Now in 3D, or computer-tween 2D, a keyframe is any position on the timeline where the animator has defined the position of the character. In-betweens are all the frames that the computer interpolates, or automatically generates, to move the character from key to key. Timing, spacing, and easing are closely related terms. Timing means the total number of frames that will be used for a movement. Spacing is the amount of change that comes between each frame. Decreasing spacing makes an object slower, and increasing spacing makes it look faster. And in digital animation, easing is how spacing is controlled, usually through a motion graph on the timeline. More on all these later. When animating, it's very useful to be able to see more than 1 frame at a time. In paper animation, this is done by having multiple drawings on a light table. But in animation software, there's often a feature called onion skinning. This lets you see semi-transparent representations of the frames behind or ahead of the current frame you're working on. This is particularly important in hand-drawn animation. Compositing is the process of putting all the individual pieces of a scene together to create the final visual output. So you might have a background, multiple characters, and some scenery, all being worked on separately. Compositing is how all those pieces get put together into a single scene. Great, hopefully that wasn't too overwhelming. Don't worry about remembering all these ideas completely. You'll understand better as we go through the next section on the 12 principles of animation. Let's get started. One of the best things a new artist can do to improve is to learn how to use reference, and animation is no exception. It's the best way to get more nuance, accuracy, and character into a performance. In this video, we're going to look at different reasons and methods for using video reference for your animations. The most extreme form of using reference is called rotoscoping. With this method, a scene is staged and filmed with actors, and then traced frame by frame. This technique isn't used that often because it sticks out and just sort of looks weird. What's more common is to gather or shoot individual pieces of reference for individual parts of the scene. In these clips from The Legend of Korra, a single performer provides the reference for all the characters in the final scene. This is more practical, especially for very physical stunts, and it leaves more room for creative freedom later during the actual animation process. Another common type of reference is to film voice actors while they're giving their performance. Obviously, this isn't to make the character look like the actor, but to give the animator ideas for how to physicalize the voice performance by seeing gestures and expressions the actor actually made while speaking. This can be taken a step further by having the actor actually give the physical performance as well. Here we can see the voice actors perform reference for the tea party scene in Alice in Wonderland.
Sugar, 2 spoons, just 2 spoons, thank you, yes. Mustard, yes, but mustard? Don't let's be silly.
It's not being copied, but the actor Ed Wynn's ideas and physicality are being exaggerated in the final animation. The way you shoot your reference depends on what you're looking to get out of it. What's most challenging about the particular piece of animation that you want the reference to help you with? There are 3 big things that you might want to pull from a piece of reference video: posing, timing, and acting. Even simple actions like walking can be surprisingly complex when you try to imagine all the specific poses that go into it. Even something small like the difference between walking and jogging can mean totally different poses. When things get more complex, like in our martial arts example, you're going to be really glad you have a visual guide to refer to. If you're shooting a reference for 2D animation, you're also going to want to use reference to get your perspective right. Shots that are at a high angle or a close-up shot with heavy perspective can make it hard to get your poses right unless you have the right reference. Another thing to look for in your reference is timing. Knowing exactly how long particular things take can be difficult off the top of your head. Having a reference takes a lot of the guesswork out of planning your scene's timing, which in turn makes everything else based on that timing easier. However, remember, you don't necessarily want to stick to your reference exactly. It's just a guide. You can exaggerate or move things around if it works better for the final scene. Maybe the most important thing to use reference for is acting. In these clips, the creators of Avatar: The Last Airbender are performing acting reference for the animators. Even though this reference doesn't match the angles or timing, you can see that they communicate the acting and attitude that comes through in the final shot. And don't be afraid to use yourself as reference. Ultimately, you're the one who knows best what the shot needs, so get in front of the camera. As you use reference, remember to keep using your own creativity and keep the 12 principles in mind.
If you have a birthday, then you... She doesn't know what a non-birthday is.
For example, here in this scene from Alice in Wonderland, you can see the animator took the general idea behind this actor's pose, but changed it so it has a better silhouette. This is the principle of staging. Always try to push your reference to the next level. It's great to shoot your own reference tailored to your scene, but if you need some basic footage for common character movements, check out these free resources. In the next video, we'll be taking some reference and going through the process of using it to plan a scene. I'll see you there. So now, let's start animating a scene. Let's say I've been given this scene from the storyboard to animate. This orc walks into frame, and then the camera pulls out and continues to watch him while he walks for a while. Then, he trips and falls down and yells, "Oh no, my poor toesies." This gives us a good picture of the content of the scene, but there are still big decisions we need to make about the timing. How long should the scene be in total? How many frames should each step of the walk take? How long should it be before he trips? How long does it take for him to say his line? These are things that we can plan out a little first. One way animators plan a scene is with an exposure sheet, also called an X sheet or dope sheet. Each row represents a frame of the animation, and each column is a layer or element in the animation. An animator would make notes on the X sheet indicating when certain things happen and what frames are keyframes. Dialogue would even be broken down sound by sound on the X sheet for doing lip sync. An X sheet is great because you can make whatever notes you want, but in digital animation, you can also just use your program's timeline to roughly plan out your animation. For our scene, I'm actually going to do both. I'm in Toon Boom Harmony, which has a digital X sheet linked to the timeline so you can see how they compare. I've already got a scene with an extra wide background set up. I'm going to start by picking a length for the entire scene. To help me with that, I shot some reference footage. I'm playing this with a program called Qt Sync that lets me add in this timecode at the top. Now I shot this video on my phone, which shoots at 30 frames per second, so we can't use the exact frame numbers since we're animating at 24 frames per second. But we just need to estimate the time anyway. So let's say that this is where we want to end. That's 13 seconds and 15 frames, which means 13.5 seconds, which at 24 frames per second would be 324 frames. Now let's mark out where the start of the trip should happen. It looks like 5 seconds and 24 frames. Let's call that 5 3/4 seconds. So on our timeline, that would be about frame 138. Let's do 139. Since I'm going to be drawing this on 2s, it's good to keep frames on odd numbers. Then let's estimate maybe 36 frames for the fall itself, which would be frame 175. He'll be on the ground. And then a little over a second to get up. Let's call it 30 frames to get up, and we'll have him up and starting his line on frame 205. All of this can and probably will change once we actually start animating, but it's good to get a picture of how the blocks of time are working within your scene. What we can't change is the length of time for the dialogue. To know that, we need the recording. There's 2 lines in the scene. There's that one scream when he trips. That one's not hard. We can just put that at the frame where he trips. This next line where he actually speaks is a little trickier.
Oh no, my poor toesies.
Here I can see the length in my audio player, but I'm just going to go ahead and import it onto the timeline, and then we can see how long it is. So now you can see we have a waveform, both on the timeline and in our X sheet. There's that bit of moaning at the start of the line. So I'm going to actually start it right after he falls, and then he'll be moaning as he's getting up. If I play the timeline, we can hear it.
Oh no, my poor toesies.
And with the waveform, we'll be able to time out our lip sync later. We could do more, but that's really all we need to get us started. We'll plan out some more details when we get to doing the walk and the lip sync. What we have marked here are essentially the keyframes or key poses of our animation. So to finish out this video, I'm going to go through and make a drawing for each of these positions. If you're working in 3D, you would be creating a pose for your character rig at each of these spots in the timeline. There we go. All ready for the next video. I'll see you there. Before we dig too far into animating, I wanted to talk about working in passes. This is a strategy that will help you make fewer mistakes and make your animations more richer and nuanced. Working in passes means focusing on animating one aspect of a character at a time. You already saw me do this with Tony the Panda in the 12 Principles lessons. In Squash and Stretch, I started by just animating his body. The main mass of your character is a great focus for the first pass, because everything else will be affected by it. Next, in follow-through and overlapping action, I added his ears. Since I had the timing and position of the head already set, I knew where the ears would be placed and could focus on how they bend and move in response to the force of the body. Then, in secondary action, I added in the tail. Since Tony can move his tail independently of the rest of his body, it needed to be given special attention in its own pass. If you try to do all these things at once, you're bound to lose track of one thing or another and make mistakes. But working in passes lets you break the character into manageable pieces. You'll see me do this as we work more with the orc scene too. When animating his walk, I'll be focusing on different parts of the body in different passes. And after everything else is animated, I'll do a pass for the face and lip sync when he says his line. So in the next video, let's dig into animating that walk. Let's talk about walk cycles. So in our orc scene, for this first big block of time, we need to have the orc walking. To do that, we're going to create a walk cycle. A cycle is a series of frames that you can loop to create a repeating action. So we just need to animate 2 steps of the walk, and then we can cycle those steps to cover the time and the distance in our scene. Walk cycles are traditionally a big part of learning character animation, so let's look at them more generally before animating our orc. When you're analyzing or inventing a walk, there are really only 4 poses that you need to focus on. This first one is called the contact pose. Here we have one for each foot. This is the point at which the front leg touches the ground, but isn't bearing the weight of the body yet. The next pose is the passing pose, and it comes between the contact poses. This is the point where the back leg passes and becomes the front leg. Then, between the first contact and the passing pose is the down position. This is where the front leg has taken the weight of the body. Then, between the passing pose and the second contact is the up pose. This is where the back leg is pushing the body up to let the other leg swing forward. From there, it's just the same poses with the legs reversed. And at that point, we're back where we started, and the cycle is complete. So it's these 4 poses, the contact, the down, the passing pose, and the up, that define the walk. The other frames are just in-betweens. Now, depending on the character and the type of walk, these poses might look radically different, and the timing between them can vary. But these are the 4 poses that give a walk its character. So when we look at our reference, these are the poses we want to find and get right. So back in our orc scene, we're going to plan out the walk in detail. Here's our reference again. Let's find a nice contact pose to use. This one at 4 seconds and 10 frames looks good. Remember, this video is 30 frames per second, so that's 4 1/3 seconds. Then let's find the next contact pose, and we'll get the time between them. It's at 4 seconds 28 frames, which is almost 5 seconds. Let's just go ahead and call it 5 seconds. So 4 1/3 seconds to 5 seconds would be 2/3 of a second for one step. On our timeline, which is at 24 frames per second, that would be 16 frames for the step. So the first contact is on frame 1, and I'll put the next one on frame 17. Remember, I'm going to round these poses to an odd numbered frame because I'm going to be drawing on 2s. Then let's find the passing pose. Here it is at 4 seconds 20 frames. So that's exactly 1/3 of a second past the start, which would put it exactly in the middle. So that's frame 9. Then we'll do the same for the down. Again, it looks like that's exactly halfway, on frame 5. And then the up pose. It's a little different because we cheated that second contact pose, but let's just say it's halfway too, on frame 13. So now that we have that all noted, I'm going to go in and draw poses for the character based on the poses in the video. I'm obviously going to have to adjust it to match the orc's proportions, and as always, I'm going to adjust things to make the silhouette as strong as possible. I'm going to work in passes and focus on just the body and legs first. Then I'm going to go in and put in the arms. And finally, I'm going to go back and focus on the swing of that club. Then I'm going to do the next set of poses for the second step. I'll mark out on the X sheet where the poses go. I'm just going to use the same timing as the first step. And now I'm going to do a pass for his hair. Now I need to fill in the in-between drawings. So now we've got all the frames we need for the walk, but we can't cycle them like this. I'm going to define a center line and then shift all the drawings so that the hips are over the center line. Now if I loop this animation, you can see we have a walk cycle that can run indefinitely. To use this walk cycle in our scene, I'm going to cycle these frames 4 times. That will get us close to the time we want. Then I'm going to animate the layer that the character is on to move them across the screen. It looks like this frame of our walk cycle is the one we really want to match up with our trip. I'm just going to slide all these frames on the timeline forward to match. That's going to leave a gap at the start, so I'm going to fill in those frames with the right ones from the walk cycle. So now he's moving, but it looks like he's kind of skating on ice. That means we have to adjust the speed that he moves across the screen so it matches the speed of his walk. To fix that, we need to change the distance that he covers. Since we have his end position right, we want to adjust his starting position. Then I just check to see if he's still ice skating. It takes a lot of guess and check to get this right. We just need to zero in on the right point we want. There, let's check it out. Okay, that's it for the walk cycle. The next step is to animate the trip and fall and the getting up. I'll go over that in the next video. I'll walk you through the process and talk a little bit about the animation principles and how I'm applying them. I'll see you there. So we finished the walk, and that got us to this point where he needs to trip and fall. I'm not going to use the reference I shot because this part needs to be much more cartoony. I'm just going to have to invent it from scratch. So we have our timing for the fall from when we planned our scene. The next step is going to go through and invent some good poses for the important parts of this fall. This trip is a lot of fast action, so the most important principles to keep in mind are staging and exaggeration. I'm trying to keep all 4 limbs visible throughout all these poses, even that back arm. That will help the silhouette read clearly. I'm also trying to keep the silhouette of his open mouth visible. That's a pretty exaggerated reaction that characterizes the animation pretty well, so I want to make sure it's as visible as possible. I'm also planning for a little bit of overlapping action by having his butt and legs drag behind him as he falls. His head is actually going to be going down as his legs are still on the way up. Here I'm checking the key poses I've done. Overall, the energy is right, but I'm going to need to use spacing to give some of those quick poses more time to read. Now I'm adding in some breakdown poses. I'm being really flexible with his spine and making sure there's a kind of wobble in his body as he tries to catch his balance. And here you can see me putting some squash in on the actual landing. And then you can see I'm getting into some in-between frames that need to go really fast, so I'm making them stretched and distorted. He's windmilling his arms trying to keep his balance. When you have really big position changes like that, using stretched smear drawings like this can help the eye follow the path of the action. I also want to get some stretch in the legs too, when he's first popping up in the air, and on the fall when they snap down into the squash position. Fall is looking okay, but the contact with the rock itself isn't strong enough, so I'm going to work on that. I'm squashing his toe so you can feel how hard the hit is, and I'm going to work on what happens to that leg after. It should look like the step was thrown off. And now I'm making some adjustments, and I'm cleaning up just a little so I can see things better. I'm also adjusting the size of some things. It's getting down to details now, so I need to make sure I know exactly where the edges of the character are to judge if the animation is working right. Here I'm doing a pass of animating the club as he loses his grip and throws it. I'm just going to say it flies off screen, so I'm not going to worry about where it lands. Then a little more fine adjustments and cleanup. Now he's down, so let's animate him sitting up and grabbing his foot. This part isn't going to be as exciting because it's not as exaggerated and fun. The big principle here will be solid drawing. Because he's turning his whole body around as he rolls and sits up, this gets into depicting the 3D form of the body and head instead of just the profile view we've been seeing up to now. As he's coming up, I'm having him do this sort of sit-up crunch position because A, he's using his legs to balance his body, and B, he's bringing his hurt foot up so he can grab it. I'm also focusing on his expression at this point because his face is going to be the focal point of the scene from this point on. Now it's a matter of finding the right poses to connect my keys. Now we've got him up, but he stops really abruptly. I'm going to do a little rocking back and forth motion. This rock is an example of another animation that could be cycled if we wanted it to go on longer. Now, before we say we're done, I'm going to go through and do a little more cleanup and see if there's any other poses that can be improved or exaggerated more. Now let's look at the final trip and fall. There we go. Now we're up to the point in the scene where he needs to speak. In the next video, we'll look at the process of animating to dialogue. I'll see you there. Now we're ready to start animating our dialogue. Animating dialogue might seem really intimidating at first because of all the lip sync you have to match up. But before we even worry about lip sync, let's back up a second. Something you don't want to forget is that one of the keys to good lip sync is getting everything else right first. You want the body language, the hand gestures, and the expressions to match the dialogue first. Those make a much bigger difference than the mouth shapes themselves. So before we worry about the mouth, we're going to get the rest of the acting right. And to do that, we need to use our audio track to map out where each sound is. Fortunately, with our sound file on the timeline, this is fairly easy. I can scrub through the timeline and hear where each sound is.
Oh no, my poor toesies.
I'm noting on my X sheet everywhere there's a new sound. Remember, when you're breaking down a line, think in terms of the sounds and not the letters that are used to spell the words. The units of sound that make up words are called phonemes. We'll look at those more in a minute. This is like what we did earlier with planning out our scene, just in much more specific detail. Now I have the sounds mapped out and noted on my X sheet, so I can start animating in sync to the audio. He's holding his foot, so he can't gesture a lot with his hands, but I'm going to make him rock back and forth, and I'm going to have him stick out his neck to accent some of those vowel sounds. And he ends on that last E sound, so I'm going to have him bring his head back and up to hold on that.
Oh no, my poor toesies. Oh no, my poor toesies. Oh no, my poor toesies. Oh no, my poor toesies.
There, that looks like he's synced up with the dialogue. He could definitely use a mouth, though. So let's deal with the lip sync itself. Different phonemes are produced by different mouth shapes. Fortunately, there really aren't that many. You only need about 9 different mouth shapes to cover all the phonemes. Here's a chart of how they match up. First, we have the vowel sounds. These are important ones to make clear since they tend to last a little longer and be accented a lot in speech. And then the consonant sounds get grouped into these other mouth shapes. You'll need to tailor each set of mouth shapes to your character, and you'll also have different ones for different emotional states. It depends on what the dialogue requires. Most animation programs will have a convenient way to let you store mouth positions and swap between them. In 3D, you create your mouth shapes using special facial controls that are part of the character rig. And you can also save these positions so you can reuse them later. So let's look at our orc. I've made a separate layer for our orc's mouth. I'll match this up with his head on each frame as we go. The drawings I made are saved as part of this layer, and I can switch between them when I'm on different frames. As you create different mouth shapes, remember that the bottom jaw goes up and down, but the top is fixed to the rest of the skull. Similarly, the top teeth are also fixed in place, and the lips just move around them to make them visible or not. Make sure they don't look like they're retracting and extending. Okay, I've got all my mouth shapes ready. So you might think now we just go through and put in the right mouth shapes for each of the phonemes in the line. But in most cases, that wouldn't end up looking right. We need to apply a principle of lip sync called phrasing. Phrasing is how speech breaks down visually into poses, or in this case, mouth positions. When we speak, we don't hit every single phoneme clearly. We smear them together as we move from the beginning of a word or phrase to the end. Keep your mouth positions restricted to only what's actually necessary. Try saying the line yourself and look at your mouth in a mirror. See what shapes you can actually see. Be sure you're saying it at the right speed. Don't slow down or the phrasing will be different. Let's go back and put the mouth on our orc. I'm matching up the mouth with the orc's head and swapping through my mouth shapes to find the right one. A really important thing to be aware of is that you want the visual, in this case the mouth shape, to precede the sound by a couple frames. It's the mouth shape that makes the sound, so it has to come first. I'm constantly scrubbing my timeline to listen to the sound as I go, keeping an eye out for any unnecessary mouth shapes. Having your mouth shapes pre-made like this makes the process actually go pretty quickly. I'm spending more time matching up the head than actually picking the mouths. Now I'm just going to clean up those temporary lines I had on that bottom layer. Let's see how that looks.
Oh no, my poor toesies. Oh no, my poor toesies. Oh no, my poor toesies.
Good, and for fun, let's look at the lip sync without the body movement.
Oh no, my poor toesies. Oh no, my poor toesies.
If you wanted, you can always go back at this point and do in-betweens for specific spots, or make special mouth shapes if you think you need them. I think this looks pretty good as is. With the body, I think there's plenty of movement already. So we have the character all animated, but our shot isn't complete yet. The last thing we need to animate is the camera. We'll do that in the next video. I'll see you there. So we have all our elements animated, but it doesn't look like our storyboard. That's because we don't have the camera animated yet. In the old days of paper animation, your camera would be locked and you had to move your elements underneath it. But now, in almost all programs, there's some way to animate your camera directly. So let's look at how to take advantage of that. Here in Harmony 12 Advanced, I have multiple views of my scene, and you can see I have this camera object that I can move around. Just like with a character rig, I set keyframes on the timeline with the camera in different positions, and the computer creates the in-betweens that make the camera move. But there's a little more to it than that. You need to keep your animation principles in mind even when animating something like a camera. Let's look at some examples before doing the final camera work for our orc scene. The biggest principle to apply is slow in and slow out. Right now, there's no slow in or slow out on the camera, so it's jarring when it starts and stops. But let's give it the same gentle S-curve easing that we looked at in the other videos. There, that feels more natural. If you've got really fast camera pans, you can even add some follow-through by having them overshoot their target position and then ease back into it. You might even want to add in arcs to your camera move. Here I've added a backwards pullout to the camera move. You can see the camera is traveling in an arc. Applying these physical principles to your virtual camera makes your audience feel like a part of the space with the characters and more connected to the action going on. Let's get the camera right in our orc scene. The camera starts in close with the orc still off screen. So I need to get the camera in a good starting position so that when he walks in, he'll be in the right spot. Then at this point, we want the camera to start moving with him. So I'll set a keyframe on the timeline. And then we have to follow him out here and set another position. I'm putting the camera further to the left than the orc because I want it to keep going for a moment when he's stopped by the rock. Then the camera comes back to find him, so I'll set the position down here and zoom in a little more. Then, so the camera isn't totally static, I'll have it slowly zoom in over the course of the rest of the scene. Then, I'll just go and adjust the easing on all these keyframes to give it some slow in and slow out. So in the top view, we can see how our camera is moving. And we can see what it looks like in the final scene.
Bah! Oh no, my poor toesies.
There we go. The rough animation of the scene is finished. From here, it would just be a matter of doing cleaned up color drawings for all of our poses, and putting in the finished background. But as far as animation itself, we're all set here. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit about the next steps you can take on your animation journey. I'll see you there! Congratulations on finishing Animation Foundations! Hopefully you're feeling eager to start applying the things you've learned in this course. Your next step is to start animating yourself. If you haven't already, consider picking up one of the Bloop Animation software courses, so you'll have the tools to apply the knowledge you've gained. Remember, this course has just been the foundation of your journey. You can dive a lot deeper into all of the concepts we've touched on. Practice will always be the best teacher, but here's some recommended reading you should also consider as you go forward. We've already talked about The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. This is where the 12 Principles came from, and it has great historical background on the Disney Animation Studio and the invention of character animation as we know it. Another book which you should definitely get is The Animator Survival Kit by Richard Williams. You may have noticed that a bunch of the example images and diagrams I've pulled for this course have come from that book, and for good reason. It's packed with incredibly clear and useful examples of animation principles and how to apply them. When you're a little further along, you should also consider Drawn to Life, Volumes 1 and 2, by Walt Stanchfield. Walt Stanchfield taught master classes at Disney Studios for 20 years, and these books are a collection of notes and examples he made for those classes. Finally, consider joining the Bloop Creators Club, where you can ask questions, share your work, and find other artists to collaborate with. But the most important thing to do is just get out there and start animating. Good luck! Slow in and slow out is probably the most important of the fundamental principles. Fortunately, it's fairly simple. Slow in and slow out refer to the tendency of objects to gradually accelerate and then decelerate when moving from one position to another. Slow in and slow out are also sometimes called ease in and ease out, or just easing. Slow in and slow out reproduce the effects of inertia. Inertia is a property of matter that makes objects continue at their current speed unless another force causes them to accelerate or decelerate. If objects move from position to position at an even rate, it looks mechanical or robotic. So we add easing to make them look more organic and natural. In hand-drawn animation, this is accomplished through spacing. Spacing refers to the amount of change between successive frames. The less the difference, the slower the movement will be. So by gradually increasing the spacing over the course of our frames, and then decreasing the spacing again, we create the illusion of acceleration and deceleration. In digital animation, both 2D and 3D, your easing will be controlled by an easing graph or spline curve. These look different in different programs, but the principle is the same in all of them. Points on the graph represent keyframes or poses that you have defined manually, and the line connecting them on the graph represents the rate of change between those keyframes. The computer then automatically generates the in-between frames with spacing that matches those speed changes. Let's take a look at an example. In this example, we're moving this car across the screen. It's moving too evenly right now. So let's bring up the easing graph, and then we can use these handles on our graph points to change the shape of the graph. The steeper the line, the faster the motion will be at that point. So let's give the graph a nice smooth S-curve like this. It starts out flat, gradually gets steeper, then evens out again. This gives us a standard slow in and slow out. If we turn on onion skinning so we can see all our frames, we can see how this translates to spacing. If you wanted the same motion in hand-drawn animation, you just need to place drawings in each of these positions. We can make the effect more extreme by adjusting the graph to be even steeper. This gives the motion a snappier, more cartoony style, especially if we also adjust the timing to make it speedier. Another reason to use slow in and slow out is to emphasize your key poses. Particularly in hand-drawn animation, you spend a lot of time creating cool key poses that communicate the point of the scene. Heavy slow in and slow out lets you spend more time in and around those poses and less time transitioning between them. This lets those key poses carry the scene. Mastering slow in and slow out is vital for effectively applying many of the other principles of animation. Here are some related principles. Feel free to jump to one of these, or just head to the next video. I'll see you there! The foundation of any animation education is the 12 principles of animation. The 12 principles were a set of core concepts that were developed in the 1930s by animators at Walt Disney Studios as they were transitioning from doing shorts to feature films. It was a gradual process of discovery and refinement as the animators tried to push their work to a new, higher standard. These principles were first compiled into the list of 12 we know today by the legendary animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston in 1981 in their book, The Illusion of Life. In creating the illusion of life is what the principles are all about. They help you create characters that look like they have weight, personality, and exist in a real world with real physics at work. Even though they were developed by 2D animators, they still apply to 3D and any other type of animation. Basically, the 12 principles are the difference between this and this. In the next set of videos, we'll go over each principle in detail and demonstrate how to apply them. You'll soon see how all the principles are related and reinforce each other. Get ready to get busy. See you in the next video. Squash and stretch describe how an object changes shape in response to forces acting on it. Squash is when an object is compressed by an impact or an opposing force. Stretch is when an object is distended by something pulling on it or by moving quickly. Let's look at some examples and then we can try for ourselves. Here's a classic bouncing ball example. You can see the ball squashes when it hits the ground and stretches here and here. These are the spots where the ball is moving at its fastest. Compare that ball to this one without any squash and stretch. You can see how the distortion of the ball emphasizes the path the ball travels, almost like motion blur. It also helps convey the rhythm of the bounce better. It's just more pleasant to watch. Another important way to use squash and stretch is to convey the material that an object is made of. Softer materials like rubber will distort more, while rigid materials like metal will distort less. However, even if you're dealing with something super rigid like this metal ball, still try to incorporate a little squash and stretch. Stretch will tend to look fine because at high speed it will seem like motion blur. And when you have an impact, even a frame or two of squash can make a big difference. Even if it's so subtle you wouldn't notice it at full speed, you can feel the impact more. It's important that when you squash and stretch, you want the volume of the object to stay consistent. Otherwise, it will just look like the object is growing and shrinking, not deforming. So if something gets shorter, it should also get wider. And if it gets longer, it should also get thinner. You probably already realize that the more you push your squash and stretch, the more cartoony your animation will look. It tends to give animation a cute or comedic effect. Exaggerated squash and stretch, and exaggeration in general, is a big part of what defines the look of classic comedy cartoons like Tom and Jerry and Looney Tunes. But even in more serious animation, you can still find squash and stretch being used, especially during fast movements and action scenes. Slipping in a squashed or stretched frame at the right moment can help make all those rapid frame changes flow together much more smoothly, making it easier for the eye to understand. If you're working in 3D, squash and stretch tends to be more subtle. Ideally, you would want a character rig that lets you distort the model to get that squash and stretch. But even if you don't have a rig that sophisticated, you can still achieve many of the same benefits of squash and stretch just by being smart about how you pose your character. Look at how this ninja jumps down from the ledge. At first glance, it seems like there's squash and stretch going on here. But if we look at the individual poses, the character isn't really distorted at all. He's just posed so his body is fully extended in the fall and folded up at the start and end of the fall. Squash and stretch, ultimately, is just about maximizing the difference in overall shape between your keyframes. So even if you're not trying to achieve a cartoony look, keep the principle of squash and stretch in mind as you pose your characters. Next, let's take a look at how to apply squash and stretch to a character. This little guy, Tony the Panda. For this video, we're only going to deal with Tony's body. The rest of him gets added in a second pass later. So Tony's going to turn his head, crouch down, and leap out of the scene. This animation is going to be 24 frames a second, animated on 2s, so I'm only going to draw on the odd-numbered frames. So we have him standing on frame 1, and we'll put his fully crouched pose on frame 13. We'll fill in the in-between frames later. We're just doing really loose sketches. Remember, we're mostly focusing on how we're posing the character. So the next keyframe for this animation is when Tony is at the top of his jump on the way out. We'll put that on frame 19. We want his body fully extended, but this isn't actually going to be the most stretched out frame. Let's put the end of his jump's arc on frame 23. It's going to be off screen, so we'll just leave it really rough. We just need it as reference to get the other frames right. So now let's start filling in the gaps. Frame 17 here is where I'm going to put our most stretched out pose. I want the jump to feel really zippy, so we're going to have him cover the whole side of this arc of the jump in just this one drawing. Now I'm going to flip through the drawings to see how the motion looks. So far so good, but we have a couple more drawings to fill in. Let's go to frame 15. You might think we would start stretching out the body here, but I'm actually going to squash him even more here. His power is coming mainly from his hind legs, so here his back is moving forward a little bit faster than his front, compressing just a little bit more before it all gets released on frame 17. We're maximizing the shape change between these two frames to make that jump extra explosive. So now let's flip again to check it out. Good, now let's fill in that missing frame 21. Again, his head's out of frame, so we'll leave that off. There, now let's recenter the camera and check the animation. Okay, so that's the stretch. Now let's go back and do the squash at the beginning. I'm actually not going to start the squash yet, but get a little stretch in on this one frame. His head is going to move up in anticipation of bending down, though his head is going to start to turn. Now let's go to frame 7. I'm putting it way down here because I want that duck to be fairly quick. Next, let's do frame 9. These drawings here will be really close together because I want him to ease in slowly to the squashed position, storing up energy for that big jump. Now for frame 5, we're going to do something interesting. His head has to cover a lot of distance in this frame, so we're going to do some stretch, but just on his face. And we'll flip to check it. There. Doing stretches like that is important to achieve this kind of zippy timing. Now we just have that last drawing on frame 11. This one is going to be really close to these other drawings. That looks like we've got it. Let's take a look at the final animation. Hopefully now you're starting to understand the principle of squash and stretch. Here are some closely related principles in case you want to try out one of those videos next. I'll see you there. Anticipation is a smaller movement that comes before a major one and signals that the major movement is about to happen. Think of a baseball swing. Even though the batter already has the bat up and seems like he could just swing, when the pitch is thrown, he raises his leg and leans back before heaving his weight forward. And, before swinging his arms, he first reaches back slightly with the bat, giving him a longer path to swing it on. You can tell just by seeing the anticipation that a powerful swing is about to follow. Another common example of anticipation is crouching down before jumping. And, in cartoons, you'll often see an exaggerated anticipation before zipping out of a scene. In general, the faster a movement is going to be, the stronger your anticipation should be. This helps the viewer's eye keep up and make it clear what happened. Anticipation can also be something subtle, like having a character's eyes move before turning their head. Anticipation is important because it serves many functions at once. It makes characters more lifelike because it replicates how people and animals actually move. It shows intention, which makes your characters look like they're thinking and choosing actively. It also helps the audience follow what's going on visually by giving them clear hints. This is especially important when you have very fast action. And lastly, it makes your major movements feel stronger. Let's look at a demo of how you can incorporate anticipation into an animation. Here we have an animation of a weightlifter. The motion looks fine, but it feels a little robotic, and it doesn't seem like the weight is very heavy. Let's add some anticipation to try to make this guy look more alive and powerful. I'm going to draw in some additional frames in green so you can distinguish them from the other frames. We're starting here at the beginning before he even bends down. I'm making him puff up his chest a little. He's taking a big breath before starting his lift. Then, down here, he's taken hold of the bar. I'm going to insert a little dip before this first big lift. You can see that that dip makes it look like he's putting a little more effort into the lift. Now, at this point, he's resting the barbell on his chest, ready for that final heave to get it over his head. To do this lift, you want to bend your knees so you can use the strength in your legs to help you accelerate the bar up and get it over your head. So we're going to anticipate that movement with a couple little bounces. This is going to take more frames than our previous anticipation, but we want this last push to feel really powerful and satisfying. We'll do one small bounce, and then at the end of that, he'll go into a deep bend, and he'll explode upward into that final extended position. There, let's see how that looks all together. Now let's compare that to our first version without anticipation. Anticipation comes in lots of different forms, both subtle and extreme. And learning to incorporate it effectively will be important to getting your animations to have an attractive, lifelike quality. Here are some other principles that are important for helping you master anticipation. Feel free to jump to one of these, or go on to the next video. I'll see you there! Staging is a broad but important concept that can be applied to really any visual art. Staging is the presentation of a shot in a way that makes the content of the shot as clear as possible and the narrative function of the shot as strong as possible. It's important to think about staging from the initial pre-production and storyboarding all the way through the final animation. Right from the beginning, when you're designing an environment, make sure there are clear visual cues that let the audience understand the nature of that environment. For example, if the scene is set in an abandoned warehouse, make sure it looks abandoned. Graffiti and a little rubble make it clear that no employees will be coming through anytime soon. As soon as the audience sees an environment, they'll automatically form an impression of it, so make sure it's the right one. In filmmaking, there are many different kinds of shots. When you're choosing a shot, consider the distance from the camera, as well as the angle of the camera. There are also many more specific shot types that each have a specific function. Each of these different shots makes the audience think about your subject in a different way. These shot choices are the vocabulary of filmmaking. Using the right one at the right time helps your story be understood. Once you've picked the type of shot, you need to think about the composition of elements within the frame. Composition is a huge topic of its own, but remember, the primary goal with filmmaking composition is to make sure your audience's eye goes exactly where you want and understands the information you want them to know. Consider all the lines, shapes, and color values in the shot, and make sure that they are all leading the audience to the important elements in the scene. A handy composition tool is the rule of thirds. Centering things in the frame tends to look static and boring. It's more dynamic to imagine that the screen is divided in thirds horizontally and vertically, and put your points of focus at the intersections. This will help you balance your compositions, particularly when you have multiple subjects in the shot. An important concept you'll need to understand in order to achieve the compositions you want is blocking. Blocking is a very old term that goes all the way back to stage plays. Blocking is the positioning and movement of characters and subjects within the environment of the scene. In 3D animation, this is done just like in a film or play, but within your virtual space. You position your camera and characters so that the camera sees what you want at any given time. As the characters and the camera move in relationship to each other, the blocking shifts from one composition to another, leading to a change in the information being conveyed. Since things are moving now, this is where we start to get into animation. Timing is an animation principle all its own, but here we mean it in the general sense of making sure the right thing happens at the right time, particularly when you have a moving camera. In general, you only want one important thing to be happening at any given time, and no other elements in the scene should be distracting. Now we're getting down to the details of character animation. Your animation is made up of a series of poses. As you choose poses, make sure to consider the staging to make sure each pose is as clear as possible. The best way to do this is with the silhouette rule. Your character and whatever they're doing should be crystal clear just from their silhouette. Shots can go by very quickly, and you don't want the audience to spend even a fraction of a second trying to figure out what they're looking at. Their brain should be focused on the story. Posing for clarity will also make your animations look better. Take a look at this walk cycle. Now look at it in silhouette. Here, where the arms are both down, you can't see them in the silhouette. Even though it's just a frame, it gives a slight stutter to the animation. It's better to adjust the timing and the pose so that the arms always break the silhouette of the body on every frame. Here are some other principles closely related to staging. Feel free to check them out or just move on to the next video. I'll see you there. Straight ahead and pose to pose are different approaches for creating animation. Straight ahead animation means creating each frame in sequence from beginning to end. Pose to pose animation means creating the key poses for each action first and then filling in the poses that come in between. Straight ahead has the advantage of spontaneity and liveliness, and sometimes it produces surprise magic that couldn't be planned. The disadvantages are that it's easy for your motion to drift off track or for your sizes to change. Also, you might miss the timing you're after or miss the point of the scene. In general, it's just more error-prone, which can waste time. Pose-to-pose animation has the advantage of putting more focus into getting key poses just right, and getting exactly the timing you want. You're less likely to make mistakes and get off track, so it saves time. The downside is that the movement might feel a little unnatural, and it just doesn't deliver the surprise magic that can come from improvising as you draw. Let's take a closer look at how these different approaches work. Let's start by looking at straight-ahead animation. Here's our old bouncing ball example. I'm just going to start in and go one frame at a time. I don't know exactly how many frames I'm going to use, I'm just feeling it out as I go. I'm keeping my onion skinning feature on so you can see the past frames I've drawn. I know at the bottom of the fall, before it hits the ground, I want it stretched out so I'm trying to transition into that shape. Then there's the squashed frame and another stretch as the ball rebounds from the impact. I'm trying to be careful to keep my sizes correct as I go. That gets harder and harder to do as I get further and further from that starting drawing. There, let's see how that looks. Now let's do another ball bounce, but this time we'll work pose to pose. I'm starting by doing the peaks of each bounce and the squash each time it hits the ground. These will be my key drawings. By doing these first, I know exactly how many bounces there will be and how much shorter they get as they go. Then I'm going to find the most important pose that comes in between the first two keys. This is called a breakdown. In this case, that's the fully stretched out frame that comes just before the squash. All the other frames in this part of the sequence are gradually becoming that breakdown. I could go through and do all the breakdowns for each bounce first, but in this case, I'm just going to animate one bounce at a time. I have enough drawings that the motion of the ball is fairly well defined, so at this point I'm just in-betweening, or filling in missing frames to smooth out the motion. Another advantage of pose-to-pose animation is that the lead animator could do keys and breakdowns and then hand off the scene to an assistant to do all the in-betweens. So now I'm just repeating the process for the other bounces. Let's see how that looks. Next, I wanted to show you pose-to-pose animation in a more modern sense. This is how you work when you have a computer-tweened animation. You would have computer-tweened animation if you're working in a 3D program or with a 2D puppet rig in Flash or Toon Boom. I have a ball again, but this time the ball is an object that we can move around. The first frame I have defined as a keyframe. So if I come out further down my timeline and move the ball, you can see in the onion skinning that the computer is calculating the position for each frame starting at my first position. Wherever I drop this ball will be the next keyframe. So the in-betweens it's giving us aren't right. They're totally even and in a straight line. To fix that, I'm going to use the easing graph. I'm in Toon Boom Harmony right now, but other 2D and 3D computer animation programs will have a similar style of graph. By adjusting this graph, we change the slow in and slow out of our object as it moves between the two keyframes we've defined. Specifically, this graph is for the Y position of the ball, so this will change how the ball moves vertically. We want the ball to start falling slowly and then get really fast by the time it touches the ground. So I'm going to use this handle to adjust the curve of the graph. The steeper the curve, the faster the ball. Here we're on our second keyframe, and I'm going to pull the handle up to make the curve steeper. That means it'll be faster. Then I'm going to switch to the first keyframe and use the handle to make the curve shallower at the beginning. That's where we want it slower. Now let's apply that and check the ball's path. There, since we've added easing to the ball's vertical movement, it now moves in a nice arc. So now we can go position our other keyframes and adjust their easing in the same way. So now our arcs are there, but we don't have any squash and stretch as the ball falls and impacts. Let's put that in. Let's start with the first squash. I can use this transform box to change the scale of the ball. But you can see it's auto-tweening the scale as well as the position. That's not what we want. So I'm going to back up a little bit to where we want the stretched out frame. I'll adjust the ball here so it's stretched. When I manipulate the ball in this way, this frame becomes a new keyframe. So now you can see how all the tweens changed based on this new stretched frame. Now I just need to do the same thing coming out of the bounce. It's almost right, but I think the ball starts stretching too soon as it falls. So I'm going to go up to this position and make a new keyframe where the ball is still fully round. There, that looks like what we want. Now we'll just go through and repeat the process for the other bounces. You can see how this is basically the same as pose-to-pose animation. We set our most important positions, and then go back and set the breakdown positions that come between them. However, now the computer is doing all the in-betweening. There, let's go ahead and see how it looks. Great. So if you're going to be doing 3D animation, you'll basically always be working pose-to-pose. But if you're doing stop motion, you'll always be working straight ahead, since you have to photograph the frames in sequence. In 2D animation, however, you have the option to mix and match. Here are some other related principles you might want to check out. Or you can just go ahead and go to the next video. I'll see you there! Follow-through and overlapping action refer to the tendency of different parts of a body to move at different speeds and come to rest at different speeds. This principle also includes the concept of drag, which is when one part of a body lags behind another when a motion starts. These animation principles are meant to replicate the scientific principle of inertia. Inertia is a property of matter that makes objects continue at their current speed unless another force causes them to accelerate or decelerate. So in this example, the main part of this robot starts moving, but the antenna wants to stay still, and because the antenna is flexible, the tip furthest from the force of the body accelerates slower than the body. This is drag. Then, when the robot stops his body, the antenna wants to keep going at its new accelerated speed, and it does keep going until it's pulled back. That's the follow-through. Then it repeats the process going backward, then forward again, getting weaker and weaker until it stops completely. Fun fact, this kind of diminishing vibration is called oscillation damping. So we get drag at the start of the action, and then follow-through at the end. And the fact that these parts of the body are moving based on different timings is called overlapping action. Note also that his arms and legs are moving on different timing too, so that's also overlapping action. In some cases, if you have a very fast or surprising action, you can use follow-through to make the motion more clear. Also, sometimes your follow-through might simply take the form of a moving hold. This is basically a very strong slow-out that lets the final pose of an action remain clear for many frames without just holding still. Let's come back to our animation of Tony the Panda and add in some overlapping action. Now there's not a lot we have to do here. Basically, we're just going to add in his ears. So as he turns, the ears are going to drag just a little bit, and then when he ducks down, they're going to drag a little bit, and then keep going for just a couple frames, and then as he starts his jump, they're going to drag a whole bunch. So there we go. It's pretty subtle, but it adds a little bit of flexibility to those ears, and it makes the jump look more powerful to have him dragging behind like that. Here are some principles closely related to follow-through and overlapping action. Feel free to jump to one of these, or just go to the next video. I'll see you there! The principle of arcs comes from the observation that living things don't move in straight lines, but rather in curved motions. Missing these kinds of arcs is a common mistake of new animators. Consider this pendulum. It's going to swing from this position to this position, but where would it be in the middle of the swing? If we just put it directly between the two extreme positions, that's obviously wrong. But even if we get the middle right and put it down here, what comes between those positions? Again, putting them right in the middle is wrong. What we need to do is draw in an arc to use as a guide to get the positioning of all these frames right. It's the same with the arms and legs of a character. Even if we're using a character rig with a skeleton that keeps our limbs from changing size, it still might not get the overall arc of a movement right. We need to be sure we're being deliberate with our arcs and making them follow the path we really want. Arcs are all over the place in a lot of everyday activities. Arcs can flow into each other and become quite complex. As you study motion, be sure to watch out for these kinds of patterns. These are what give movements their character. You can also intentionally add or exaggerate arcs in your character's movement to make them more lively and interesting. This head turn looks fine at first. You might not say there's anything wrong with it. But if we try adding a little dip, creating an arc, it looks much more human. And if we exaggerate the arc, it takes on a whole new personality. Here are some other principles related to arcs. Feel free to jump to one of these, or just head to the next video. I'll see you there! Secondary action refers to smaller movements or gestures designed to support the primary actions of a character. It's important to note that secondary action needs to be subordinate to the main action and not distract from it. Secondary action should also make the point of the shot clearer by emphasizing the attitude or motivation behind the movement. So let's take a look at this animation as an example. What would you say this is an animation of? You'd probably say it's an animation of a tired guy jogging. You probably wouldn't say it's an animation of a tired guy jogging, then exhaling heavily, and then wiping his brow. The facial expression and the brow wipe are both secondary actions, but they both mesh into the overall action of jogging and emphasize the character's tiredness. They enhance instead of distract. You also want to make sure your secondary action can actually be seen. So keep the principle of staging in mind to make sure all your movements are clear. We wouldn't have him do that facial expression and brow wipe at the same time because his hand would be covering his face. It's easy to confuse secondary action with overlapping action, which we covered in the video on the principle follow through and overlapping action. Secondary action is similar to overlapping action, but there is an important distinction. The difference is that overlapping action is driven by the same force as the primary action, but moves on different timing. Secondary action, however, is driven by a different force. It enhances the idea of the primary action, but it isn't directly caused by it. So on our jogger, the movement of his shirt and hair are overlapping action, because they are a result of the motion of the run. His facial expression and brow wipe, however, are secondary actions because they're generated by forces separate from the running. They aren't an inherent part of that action, they're additions that come from the character's emotional state. Let's go back to our animation of Tony the Panda and add in some secondary action. We've got his body done, so now we're going to add in his tail as secondary action. We're going to do it on a separate layer so we can see its motion more easily. I'm adding in some extra frames at the beginning so his tail has a little time to move before his body starts. Then, as he starts to turn, the base of his tail doesn't get pulled along with the body, but the end is still doing its own thing for a frame or two before it starts whipping around. Now we want the tail's movement to enhance the main action, which is the jump. So I'm going to put in a little whip action as he leaves the ground. From this point, the tail is basically just being pulled along with the body, so it's not really secondary action at this point, since it isn't moving under its own power. Okay, I've got all the frames in, so let's play it back and see how it looks. There you go. He definitely looks cuter with his tail, and that whip action makes the jump look much more powerful. I think that's a good addition to this animation. Here are some other principles related to secondary action. Feel free to jump to one of these or head to the next video. I'll see you there. Timing is controlling the speed of an action through the number of frames used to represent that action. Timing is probably the most fundamental of the 12 principles since it gets at the essence of what makes animation and even film itself work in the first place. Animation is an optical illusion. If a series of images with slight variation are displayed fast enough, those changes in position are perceived by our brain as movement. The number of images and the rate at which they're shown determines their speed. The standard frame rate for film is 24 frames per second, and this is what most animators do their work at. So if you're working at 24 frames per second, and you want an action to take 1 second, it needs to be made up of 24 frames. And if you want it to take half a second, it would need to be 12 frames. Timing should not be confused with spacing, though they are related. Timing is the total number of frames that make up an action. Spacing refers to the amount of change between those frames, which also affects the speed of the object. See the video on the principle slow in and slow out to learn more about spacing and easing motion. The timing of an action is a big part of making it look clear, accurate, and realistic, but it also has a big effect on the personality behind an action. Look at how this hand presses this button. It seems pretty casual, but if we speed it up, it looks angry or panicky. And if we slow it down, it looks apprehensive or nervous. Keep in mind these animations all have the same key poses and easing. It's just the total number of frames that's changed. We can also play around with the timing within the motion. Currently, this press position comes about halfway through the motion. But if we shift it around so there's more frames before the press and fewer after, now this guy definitely seems scared. If you're working in 3D or with a digital 2D character rig, you're primarily thinking in terms of the actual time, since most of the frames are being generated for you by the computer. But if you're doing hand-drawn animation, you need to think about the number of drawings you'll need. Fortunately, even if you're working at 24 frames a second, you don't necessarily need to do 24 drawings to fill those 24 frames. That's because it's common to do hand-drawn animation on twos, which means holding each new drawing for 2 frames. So in that case, a second of an animation is only 12 drawings instead of 24. This generally looks fine, especially with slower motion. However, you might need to switch to animating on ones when things speed up, and there's a lot of difference between frames. You might need those extra drawings to smooth out the motion so it's clearer to the eye. It's easy to mix and match ones and twos, so just look out for any spots that might need an extra in-between frame. It's also typical for higher-end animation, like feature films, to be done entirely on ones, because it almost always looks better, especially when projected on a large screen. Here are some other principles closely related to timing. Feel free to jump to one of those, or just head to the next video. I'll see you there! Exaggeration means representing a subject in a heightened or more extreme way rather than strictly realistically. And while exaggeration can be used in live action, one of the biggest benefits of animation is that you can exaggerate without being held back by real physical limitations. There are several reasons to use exaggeration. It can add clarity to your animation by making the intent behind an image unmistakable. It can make an action more impactful by adding more visceral sense of the forces and emotions behind an action. And it can add appeal to your animation by making it more interesting to look at. Let's look more closely at all of these. In the video on the principle of staging, we talked about the importance of making poses and compositions as easy to understand as possible. Exaggeration is a great way to do this. You can exaggerate a pose to make the silhouette more clear. You can exaggerate an expression to make an emotion more clear. You can exaggerate a design and action to make personality more clear. Or you can exaggerate a composition to make a situation more clear. When you have intense action, you don't just want your audience to see it, you want them to feel it. Here's an animation that seems all right. But now, let's insert some exaggerated poses into this sequence. At full speed, you wouldn't notice how exaggerated those poses are, but you can notice how much stronger the motion feels. We can even keep going and add some more exaggeration to the scene. And for a final touch, we can even make the camera shake. Now this scene has a lot more impact. Appeal is an animation principle all its own, with its own video, but exaggeration is a great tool for getting more appeal into your animation. When you exaggerate, you're offering your audience the chance to see something they can't just see anywhere. Exaggeration and caricature let you make characters unlike anything else. Exaggeration also lets you create actions and situations that aren't possible anywhere outside of animation. And it lets characters express themselves in ways that can't be done in real life, but somehow capture what those emotions really feel like. All of these things just inherently draw the eye and make an audience pay attention. That's what appeal is all about. Here are some principles closely related to exaggeration. Feel free to jump to one of these, or just head to the next video. I'll see you there! Solid drawing means drawing and posing characters in a way that creates a sense of volume, weight, and balance. It might seem like this only applies to hand-drawn animation, but 3D artists can learn from it too. Drawing for animation requires being able to draw a character from any pose or angle, so you need to be able to draw with three-dimensionality in mind. Doing this involves general principles like overlap and perspective, which make your drawings look like they exist in a real 3D space. There are also specific ways of making lines and designing characters that make them feel like they have volume and flexibility. Getting volume in hand-drawn animation all comes down to drawing skills. However, in 3D animation, or stop motion, volume isn't a problem since you actually have a 3D object. However, remember, volume is only one piece of the puzzle. Weight and balance are a challenge for 3D as well as 2D animation. Weight and balance come down to how you pose a character. Something to avoid is posing a character symmetrically. This is also called twinning. You generally never want both sides of the body to be doing the same thing at the same time. Even at more oblique angles, this still looks unnatural and too symmetrical. It's better to get as much variety as you can into the different parts of the body. This is because people tend to shift their weight around unevenly when standing still. Balance comes in as people adjust other parts of their body to keep their center of mass over their feet or whatever is supporting them. Showing how a character keeps themselves balanced in response to moving their body mass is a big part of getting weight into a character. Make sure to look out for twinning and balance on all your poses. Here are some other principles related to solid drawing. Feel free to jump to one of these, or just continue to the next video. I'll see you there! Appeal is probably the broadest concept of the 12 principles. Appeal is a very broad term for any qualities of a character's design that make them inherently compelling to watch. This starts with good character design, which has to then be carried through to how the character is animated. Appeal could come from a character being attractive, cute, intimidating, funny, elegant, monstrous, or simple. Appeal is somewhat subjective, but there are general rules to follow that will help you make your designs more appealing. A good place to start is to think about how your main characters will work together. Varying the basic shapes used in your character's construction will help keep them interesting and distinct. Similarly, remember the silhouette rule. You want each character to have some attributes or shapes or proportions that make them recognizable even in silhouette. A good way to get a diversity of shapes and clear silhouettes is through exaggeration and caricature. Emphasize whatever gives them the qualities you're after, and de-emphasize things that aren't as important. As you're doing all this, don't forget to keep it simple. Detail is going to draw the eye and take mental energy to process, especially when things are in motion. Detail is not only impractical in animation, but it tends to distract from other qualities of your character that you really want the audience to be focused on. Once you have a design with the qualities you want, you need to make sure they also move in a way that further enhances their design. Cute characters should move cutely. Strong characters should show strength. Elegant characters should move elegantly. Eerie characters should move eerily. Of course, it can also be appealing to purposely contrast a character design and their style of motion. Just make sure your animation is thought out as much as your character design. Here are some other principles related to appeal. Feel free to jump to one of these, or continue to the next video. I'll see you there!